Aims, ideals do not exist simply in mind. They exist in character, in personality and action. One might call the role of artists, intellectual inquirers, parents, friends, citizens who are neighbors, to show that purposes exist in an operative way. John Dewey, Lectures, 1932. Philosophy is as important for us as politics. It teaches us to think well about the purposes and priorities of life. Philosophy considers the way we think, the inclinations and ramifications of the use of certain vocabularies for how we justify beliefs, and the political implications of the differences. When done well, philosophy can show us new ways to find agreement, to reduce harm, and open us to new alternatives and a brighter future. Epistemologies are what we call the various projects alive in the discussions about the dynamics of our bodies, our language, and how we can reach agreement in questions about issues like the qualities of an electron, or the basis of our understanding of the good for us individually and collectively. The dominant notion of epistemology is that to be rational, to be fully human, we need to be able to find agreement with other human beings. The best epistemology must also be the most useful in its service to human flourishing. It must support peoples developing properly and fully, support growth, maturing, making full use of the potentialities, capacities, and faculties that, under favorable conditions, they naturally have in an early age. Democratic, open societies aim for institutions organized in such a way as to prevent the harm and promote the flourishing which constitute our experiences of freedom. This is best accomplished by pursuing the position that the moral decisions to be enforced by a pluralist and democratic state's monopoly on violence are best made by public discussions in which voices claiming to be gods or sciences or reasons are put on par with everyone else's. This is the position we are taking when we define ourselves by the documents which underwrite our democracy and its pluralist character. This at the same time defines our epistemology. Who we are as a nation is bound up in the character of the discourse by which we justify our actions. We are a democracy and a plural society when the justifications for our actions are not usurped by the man of God or the views of science or the voice of reason. In a democratic society, a free society is maintained by the insistence that each of these expressions of the wider self through which saving experiences come be reduced to the community of causes and consequences, in which we, with those we have not met, are enmeshed. That widest and deepest symbol of the totality of being, imagination calls the universe. This pluralistic, democratic political position expresses the notion that we should not have an epistemic notion of truth. That truth, whether it is the word of God or the character of an electron, should be seen as different from the justifications from which they are constituted. Different because you can have all of the justification in the world and still not have truth. This is the case because we cannot tell the difference between a true belief and one that fits all of our evidence, one that we all agree on, one that other people agree with, and one that we respect. We cannot tell the difference between these and being right. Pushing past this, what we can do with our language, the recursive structure of language, and saying, I have truth, amounts only to insisting one is right about something without evidence. Democratic discourse sees the value of truth in its normative function, as the essential concept of propositional attitudes. Philosophically important because we do not know what a belief is without the concept of truth, because a belief is something true or false, or at least normative, better or worse than some competing belief. Truth is a concept by which we orient ourselves with the world, with each other. Truth facilitates agreement with others in our efforts to have a world and a language which makes sense for us, in the sense that some particular thing fits with all of the other things that we think we know. Truth is something useful in our experience. When the flow of experience breaks down, when something confounds us, thought takes up with truth being one of the concepts, making thought possible at all. By allowing our belief in some aspect of our experience of some situation to be accurate, appropriate, the notion of truth facilitates our unready-to-hand relationships in the world, to use Heidegger's phrasing. Truth, along with concepts like space, time, causality, and so on, make belief in justification and knowledge possible for us. Insistence on a position of objective or absolute truth as justification for our actions amounts to the mere opinion that one view of the point and meaning of human life is superior to another. Such a notion of truth is incompatible with a pluralistic society. To hold this view is to take up a position outside the community of causes and consequences, within which we all justify our actions, while claiming some moral knowledge greater than the political morality we negotiate out of the circumstances directly bearing upon us, on our individual pursuits of private perfection and human flourishing. Our Declaration of Independence calls for political morality for the sake of unalienable rights endowed by our Creator, rights to equality in our pursuits of private perfection, liberty, and human flourishing, happiness. The notion of divinity here is tied to the notion of the moral order of the universe, something like the Emersonian idea that the universe has a moral order, which soul is moral, being also the soul within the soul of man. The moral soul is the eye's brilliancy, or the skin's softness, the flourishing potentialities, capacities, faculties of the eye, the skin, the complex adjustments to novel stimulation. A register which extends from amoeba adjusting to changes in temperature, to bees dancing, to chess players checkmating, and to people like ourselves fomenting scientific, artistic, and political ideas. The distinction here is between right and good form. Here, right is phronesis, the virtue of practical thought, of which good for is the determinant. The right is defined as that which maximizes the good. Such teleological ethics use ought on the basis of some consideration of some good or harm, by which one arrives at the conclusion that one ought to do something. The moral order of the universe, the soul within the soul of man, is alive in the network of oughts, in the complex adjustments to novel stimulation, which promote good and reduce harm, promote flourishing, the eye's brilliancy, the skin's softness. The soul of man expresses a different register of teleology, as humans are capable of pursuing goals they consciously set for themselves. Good and harm bear on the human soul the responsibility of authenticity. It is not sufficient to the task of flourishing to hope for scientific or moral inquiry or some supernatural force to fully capture what it is that makes me myself, my own most self. Doing so, living a life as oneself, one's own most self, is an extension of the moral order of the universe, like the eye's brilliancy or the skin's softness. It is to be a moving teleology of complex adjustments to the novel stimulation of a human life. Such adjustments cannot yield useful results for following concepts or rules or propositions. One cannot, say, be rational, love the good, and then discard the part of themselves that is going against that. As Pascal observed in 1670, the constitution of the soul of man is fundamentally contradictory, and this cannot be morally dealt with by privileging the mind over the body. We are not essentially minds, but essentially bodies and essentially minds, and we are stretched on this conflict. A conflict between the infinite and the finite, the temporal and eternal, the possible and the necessary, the reconciliation of which is only the actualizing of the potentialities of the organism, its flourishing. The flourishing of the human condition cannot be accomplished by adopting an identity waiting to be discovered, a set of norms and rules to follow. one must discover a project and purposes to commit to passionately, and thus become what it entails, or else only drift in and out of affairs. One must find a calling. The alternative is a life banal, standard, and routine. Flourishing for the human soul means responding in an alive, lively way to the particular situation. You have no guidelines, which is what it means to be authentic. The words characterizing such a theory of knowing, the fruit of which is the beliefs informing our actions, are vulnerability, commitment, risk, and meaning. These terms express the character with which we must engage the complex adjustments to novel situations and circumstances of which life is made up. For example, when something goes wrong, you try to formulate a rule that says, don't do that sort of thing in that sort of situation again. Then you try to follow that rule. Doing so makes you rigid and routine and standard, stuck at mere competence, robot-like, less than flourishing. The alternative is simply to feel bad about your mistakes and good about what works and dwell on them. Be present to yourself, not regretful. This approach in life is known as phronesis, the ability to consider the mode of action in order to deliver change, especially to enhance the quality of life. Phronesis is about the way our body has of grasping the gestalt of what is going on. Our body is always moving us to get an optimal grip of a situation. As we interact with objects, they call out to us to get into the best relation to them as a function of our familiarity with the world. All of this takes place outside of what our mind does or could do. Normativity, that is, better and worse, goes all the way down to the bottom of our experience. It is our perception of objects. Skillful coping is when this flow of bodily experience is grasping the gestalt of situations. You live and act and get experiences and learn. You finally become a person of practical wisdom, to use Aristotle's terms, which means you will do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time in the appropriate way, exhibiting mastery of some kind or another. Phronesis, Aristotle recognized, is both necessary and sufficient for life. It is the approach to how we learn and know things, and also our biological, normative process of human flourishing, of moving through the stages from novice to expert, which moves along the axis from confounding to getting things right to getting things right effortlessly. This is what it is like when we become an excellent cook, or driver, or listener, and so on. Without our embodied ability to grasp meaning, relevance slips through our non-existent fingers. The world in which our theory of knowledge must function is a field of significance organized by and for beings like us, with our bodies' desires, interests, and purposes. This is a world apart from the Cartesian, Lockean picture of a mind seeking to get in touch with the reality outside of itself. In a Darwinian account of human beings as animals doing their best to cope with the environment, doing their best to develop tools which will enable them to enjoy more pleasure and less pain, words are among the tools which these clever animals have developed. There is no way in which tools can take one out of touch with reality, no matter whether the tool is a hammer, or a gun, or a belief, or a statement. Tool using is part of the interaction of the organism with its environment. To see the employment of words as the use of tools to deal with the environment, rather than as an attempt to represent the intrinsic nature of that environment, is to repudiate the question of whether human minds are in touch with reality, the question asked by the epistemological skeptic. No organism, human or non-human, is ever more or less in touch with reality than any other organism. The very idea of being out of touch with reality presupposes the un-Darwinian, Cartesian picture of a mind which somehow swings free of the causal forces exerted on the body. The Cartesian mind is an entity whose relations with the rest of the universe are representational rather than causal. So to rid our thinking of the vestiges of Cartesianism, to become fully Darwinian in our thinking, we need to stop thinking of words as representations and start thinking of them as nodes in the causal network which binds the organism together with its environment. Seeing language and inquiry in this biologistic way permits us to discard the picture of the human mind as an interior space within which the human person is located. It is only this picture of a Cartesian theater which makes one think that there is a big philosophical or scientific problem about the nature or origin of consciousness. We should substitute a picture of an adult human organism as one whose behavior is so complex that it can be predicted only by attributing intentional states, beliefs, and desires to the organism. On this account, beliefs and desires are not pre-linguistic modes of consciousness, which may or may not be expressible in language, nor are they names of immaterial events. Rather, they are what, in philosophical jargon, are called sentinel attitudes. That is to say, dispositions on the part of the organism. They are simply tools for coordinating our behavior with those of others. This is not to say that one can reduce mental states such as beliefs and desires to physiological or behavioral states. It is merely to say that there is no point in asking whether a belief represents reality, either mental reality or physical reality, accurately. That is, for pragmatists, not only a bad question, but the root of much wasted philosophical energy. The right question to ask is, for what purposes would it be useful to hold that belief? Critics of naturalism think that unless there is something absolute, something which shares God's implacable refusal to yield to human weakness, we have no reason to go on resisting evil. If evil is merely a lesser good, if all moral choice is a compromise between conflicting goods, then, they say, there is no point in moral struggle. The lives of those who have died resisting injustice become pointless. But to us pragmatists, moral struggle is continuous with the struggle for existence, and no sharp break divides the unjust from the imprudent, the evil from the inexpedient. What matters for pragmatists is devising ways of diminishing human suffering and increasing human equality, increasing the ability of all human children to start life with an equal chance of happiness. This goal is not written into the stars, and is no more an expression of what Kant called pure practical reason than it is the will of God. It is a goal worth dying for, but it does not require backup from supernatural forces. The pragmatist view of what opponents of pragmatism call firm moral principles is that such principles are aberrations of past practices, way of summing up the habits of the ancestors we most admire. For example, Mill's greater happiness principle and Kant's categorical imperative are ways of reminding ourselves of certain social customs, those of certain parts of the Christian West, the culture which has been, at least in words if not in deeds, more egalitarian than any other. The Christian doctrine that all members of the species are brothers and sisters is the religious way of saying what Mill and Kant said in non-religious terms, that considerations of family membership, sex, race, religious creed, and the like should not prevent us from trying to do unto others as we would have them do to us, should not prevent us from thinking of them as people like ourselves, deserving the respect which we ourselves hope to enjoy. But there are other firm moral principles than those which epitomize egalitarianism. One such principle is that dishonor brought to a woman of one's family must be paid for with blood. Another is that it would be better to have no son than to have one who is homosexual. Those of us who would like to put a stop to the blood feuds and the gay bashing produced by these firm moral principles call such principles prejudices rather than insights. It would be nice if philosophers could give us assurance that the principles which we approve of, like Mill's and Kant's, are rational in a way that the principles of the blood revengers and the gay bashers are not. But to say that they are more rational is just another way of saying that they are more universalistic, that they treat the difference between women of one's own family and other women, and the difference between gays and straights, as relatively insignificant. But it is not clear that failure to mention particular groups of people is a mark of rationality. To see this last point, consider the principle "thou shalt not kill." This is admirably universal, but is it more or less rational than the principle "do not kill unless one is a soldier defending his or her country, or is preventing a murder, or is a state executioner, or a merciful practitioner of euthanasia"? I have no idea whether it is more or less rational, and so do not find the term rational useful in this area. If I am told that a controversial action which I have taken has to be defended by being subsumed under a universal, rational principle, I may be able to dream up such a principle to fit the occasion, but sometimes I may only be able to say, well, it seemed like the best thing to do at the time, all things considered. It is not clear that the latter defense is less rational than some universal-sounding principle which I have dreamt up ad hoc to justify my action. It is not clear that all the moral dilemmas to do with population control, the rationing of health care, and the like should wait upon the formulation of principles for their solution. As we pragmatists see it, the idea that there must be such a legitimating principle lurking behind every right action amounts to the idea that there is something like a universal, supranational court of law before which we stand. We know that the best societies are those which are governed by laws rather than by the whim of tyrants or mobs. Without the rule of law, we say, human life is turned over to emotion and to violence. This makes us think that there must be a sort of invisible tribunal of reason administering laws which we all, somewhere deep down inside, recognize as binding upon us. Something like this was Kant's understanding of moral obligation. But, once again, the Kantian picture of what human beings are like cannot be reconciled with the history of our biology. Both teach us that the development of societies ruled by laws rather than by men was a late, fragile, contingent evolutionary achievement.